Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alden Landry, and I'm an emergency medicine physician at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, an assistant professor of emergency medicine and assistant dean of the Office for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Partnership at Harvard Medical School, and I'll be moderating and hosting this webinar today. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Harvard Medical School Office for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Partnership, the Tour for Diversity in Medicine, and the Biomedical Sciences Career Program. This session the mission of the DICP is to advance diversity and inclusion in health, biomedical, behavioral, and STEM fields in ways to build individual and institutional capacity to achieve excellence, foster innovation, and to ensure equity in health locally, nationally, and globally. DICP efforts support the career development of junior faculty, trainees, and students, identify and train leaders in academic medicine and health policy, and provide programs that address crucial pipeline issues. The BSCP provides students of every race, ethnic background, gender, and financial status, and with encouragement, support, and guidance needed for the successful pursuit of biomedical sciences and other science-related careers. And the Tour for Diversity in Medicine's mission is to educate, inspire, and cultivate future physicians, dentists, pharmacists, and other health professionals of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds by forming local connections in order to fulfill a national need. I'm very excited to have this conversation about applying the application process to MD-PhD programs and to help you put together the pieces of your application and to answer your questions. We have almost 400 registrants joining us today for this discussion on applying to MD-PhD programs. Before I introduce your panelists today, we do have a few housekeeping notes. Number one, the chat is not available. Microphones are muted. And if you have questions that you would like to pose to the panelists, please use the Q&A function. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the DICP website. And lastly, closed caption is available should you need it. It is now my pleasure to introduce the speakers for the panel. First, I'll introduce Dr. Travelle Ellis. She is the Health Equity Director at Exact Sciences. Next, I'll introduce student Dr. Tamina Keinka. He is an MD PhD candidate at Harvard Medical School. And lastly, Dr. Robert Trevino, who is a graduating resident physician in the Department of Pediatrics at the Medical College of Wisconsin. So we will have two discussions today. Our first discussion is going to be around just the general application process, getting a better understanding of MD PhD programs. And then the second part of our conversation is going to be around really diving in on what it takes to be successful in matching in MD PhD programs. So with that, I will like to have my panelists just say a quick hello, and maybe if there's anything else you'd like to add about yourself. And I'll go first to you, Dr. Ellis.
Thanks, Dr. Landry. So Travelle Ellis, as introduced, I did my MD PhD at the University of Wisconsin. I ended up leaving post-graduation to go to industry. So I call myself an industry physician scientist. We'll get more into that later, but I really have enjoyed becoming an MD PhD physician scientist and excited that you all have joined us this afternoon.
Next will be you, Tamina.
Yes, Tamina, born and raised in Nigeria. I did my undergrad at a historically Black college in North Carolina, and then spent a couple of years after that in doing research over at MIT. We'll cover that again also in a little bit. In my fourth year now of the MD PhD program, still kind of like figuring out exactly what I want to work on.
Last but not least, Robert.
Hey guys, like Dr. Landry said, I'm Robert Trevino. I'm currently a resident in pediatrics. My path through all of this has been a little curvy. I did not come in intentionally doing an MD PhD, but I've enjoyed what I've done. And we'll kind of address some of those issues that I face later, but I did my MD PhD training at Rush Medical College in Chicago.
Awesome. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. So I'm going to set the stage with an opening question for you, Travelle. What does a traditional MD PhD training look like?
Yes, so your typical MD PhD training comprises a 7 to 8 year program. So the idea is that as a physician scientist or MD PhD, you'll be trained both with a medical degree, so MD, as well as a true PhD. So the sandwich is 2 years of medical school, 3 to 5 years of PhD, and then 2 more years of medical school, like your clinical rotation. So that comprises your 7 to 8. Some schools allow for flexibility. So I know some schools have shortened the first 2 years for MD PhD students to allow them to get to their research sooner. Some have been flexible in letting PhD students do their medicine years in the interim. But the point is that you get 2 full degrees across the 7 to 8 years.
Awesome. Thank you, Travelle. Next, I want to go to you, Tamina. Actually, my next question is for you, Robert. How feasible is it to be both a physician and a researcher? And do people have labs and also practice?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting with where we're at from the physician scientist track pathway and how people look at their careers right now is that there are a lot of opportunities and options available to people. I think traditionally we thought of the physician scientists as individuals who had a lab and found some sort of balance between their clinical and research work. But more and more what we're finding is that individuals are having a little bit harder time with having that lab-based research environment for themselves and finding that balance. And it's a very competitive landscape when it comes to acquiring those research dollars. But I think also what we're starting to see is that people are taking physician scientist training in a lot of different non-lab based areas. So really in the last 10 years, I'd say you're seeing a lot more people go into humanities, social sciences, really thinking about epidemiology, public health as ways of adding into their backgrounds and using that as their PhD training. It's still a very small portion of those who go into this background, but I think it's a growing part and definitely one important for people to recognize that it's not just bound to being in a lab. But I do think that depending how you want to structure your career, all of those opportunities are available to you.
You know, it's interesting as you say that, Robert, because, you know, my initial inkling of what an MD PhD would look like, and when I was about to apply to medical school, is I was going to be 50% in the lab and then 50% in the hospital. And it seemed overwhelming. And then it also seemed like you were trying to juggle a lot as part of your practice. So it's really helpful to understand this. And we're going to tease this out a little bit more because it seems like career options are pretty wide for people once they once they graduate from an MD PhD program, and they can go in a lot of different directions. And with what Travelle does, what you're interested in doing, it seems like there's a lot of space for people to consider a myriad of career options. So Tamina, as someone who is currently enrolled in an MD PhD program, what made you consider this educational path?
I feel we just kind of touched on it, to be honest. It was like there's so many paths and all of them kind of excited me very much. But it was honestly a very, very difficult decision for me. Like in my undergrad years, I knew that I enjoyed research, like I enjoyed being in lab, but I also, based off of my very limited experience and idea of what a doctor was and what a doctor did, I thought I enjoyed medicine as well. So I decided, as I mentioned, after undergrad to spend 2 years being full-time in lab and to kind of get a sense of, okay, I enjoyed working in a lab 10 hours a week, but if I just do only that, will it still be as interesting to me? When I did that and I finished that and I was like, oh, I still want to be in lab. I was like, oh, that's like a very strong sign that this might actually be for me. So in preparation for this question, actually, I talked to a lot of my classmates to understand and get a wider scope of why people chose to do this. And I got a whole range of answers, but basically the overlap was people enjoyed taking care of the patient individually. They enjoyed like meeting the individual, understanding their specific problem, but they also wanted to be able to cater and answer questions that would affect patients that they actually never even met. That was a very, very big reason. Some people mentioned that medicine in and of itself is such an interdisciplinary field. There are a lot of policy issues, tech issues, issues related to like humanities and so on, and having training in those specific areas would also allow you to make a contribution to patients that you've never even met as well. And a couple of people mentioned the flexibility of the PhD years. So the PhD, unlike an MD, provides you the opportunity to kind of explore a little bit, like personally, professionally, see what other career options exist, and to figure out exactly where you think you will fit in best. And I think finally, the last answer I got was an MD puts your research in context. So when you're working on cancer on a cellular level in a lab, like seeing a patient with that disease, caring for a patient with that disease and understanding the human impact was something people really wanted to see and like appreciate. It gave their work meaning in lab. So those were several reasons why I considered.
You know, it's interesting that you put it in that context, because a lot of the practice of medicine is really when you're interfacing with patients, when you're in the OR, when you're in the clinic, when you are in the hospital, when you're in the emergency department. But it sounds like a lot of your classmates and even yourself thought about this as to, well, how do we address the problems separate from what we're doing with direct patient care to have an impact on medicine globally, or in a particular subspecialty or a particular area, whether it's cancer or infectious disease or even health policy that may either prevent the patient from being in the hospital in the first place or help improve their care down the stream. Is that a fair assessment of what you were trying to say?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. You know, it's like a broader scope. It's like saying, okay, let me zoom out a little bit beyond this specific patient and think about patients I've never even seen and start addressing problems. Because if you're addressing the policy issues, it might not actually get you that person into the hospital in the first place. If you address some of the therapeutic issues, then you might be able to solve problems that you feel helpless in the clinic. So yeah, I was zooming out.
I love it. All right. So Robert, as someone who is finishing their training, right, and you've been in this road for a long time, I think I met you when you were a second-year medical student. Is that correct? I think before you even started your PhD, and now you're finishing your training. You're finishing your residency. As you reflect back, what would you have done differently in pursuing your MD PhD? And I think part of that goes to that non-traditional path that you had, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so to give you guys a little bit of a background, the only research that I did prior to med school was a work study project that I did at some point in college that I could talk to you for maybe 30 seconds about what the project was, because I remember nothing about it. And, I went into college thinking that research was this lab-based thing that you had to do. And when I saw other pre-med students doing it, I never found a question or something that I was interested enough in to actually say, this is what I want to put time towards. And it was interesting because once I actually got into a classroom, and I actually taught middle school science before medicine, I started finding questions that were interesting to me and started to realize that some of this piece about research isn't just those preconceived notions that we all may have about what you do. It's also about the questions that are important to you. And I think Tamina started to hit on this about how people find those connections between their clinical work and what they do in the lab and their research. For me, though, what was interesting with how I went about doing this, I didn't go into my PhD thinking about that connection. I finished my third year of med school and wanted to do a one-year research project and get a master's to see if I liked research. My background was more, education and biology type things, but our anatomy department had a training grant, which was going to provide me funding for that 1 year. And it seemed like a good option just to get my feet wet. About 6 months into the project, working in cartilage biology and definitely more lab-based, bench-based work with working on some mechanical engineering pieces, but then also doing PCRs and Western blots, I started to realize that I kind of liked what we were doing, but I liked it because it was an interesting question. So I switched my master's to a PhD. And when people kept asking me, what do I want to do with this? One of the biggest regrets I have is not really asking myself those questions at the start of my training. So when I first met actually both Travelle and Alden, I really didn't know what I was doing when it came to the MD-PhD stuff, because I went in with, I think, not necessarily the wrong mindset, but a different mindset than I should have been thinking about. And so questions that people kept asking as my PhD training went along about how I was going to use the PhD in my future career and what it meant for residency, I had no answer for, because it wasn't something that I had given thought to until people really started pushing me on those. And that was one thing I think is important for everyone to realize, that if you're going to go down this path, thinking about what your interests are and how pieces connect is important. And I think it's equally important to know that maybe you like research and research in a topic that doesn't connect to what you want to do clinically. So right now I'm a pediatrics resident, and my PhD work of looking at how cartilage breaks down, really it does not have a lot of clinical relevance to what I do on a day-to-day. But the research that I've continued to do in residency is more education and community-based, and that's the stuff that I really enjoy doing. And it's probably going to be the direction that I take my research career past residency into fellowship and beyond. And so as you're thinking about all of these parts, recognize that there's going to be different levels of support there for you. For you guys at this stage, utilizing the AAMC as well as ACOMAS to find out what dual degree programs are out there, which will include information about the different PhDs they offer. So I know there's a question in the Q&A about finding out about the social humanities and those other pieces. Both of those websites have lists of the programs that exist and the PhDs that they offer. I think also looking into other student groups like the American Physician Scientists Association, and as well as social media can be helpful to kind of see what those experiences are for people who maybe go about this in a non-traditional path, but also those who go through the traditional, 7-8 year plan like Travelle had been talking about. But there definitely are people who take the path uncharted with this. One of my regrets in doing this was in not thinking about it fully. Like, there was definitely some financial pieces that I left on the table. I can take those in and deal with that because I like what I'm doing, and I now see how it all comes together. But I think when you leave those questions unanswered for yourself, or unaddressed at least, you do kind of leave things open for yourself in terms of the financial support that may be there. I think one other piece too for you guys to understand is, for residency and fellowship training, there are a lot more options as we go on in time in terms of having research training incorporated into your clinical fellowship or clinical residency and fellowship training. And so we're seeing more and more beyond just doing internal medicine or pediatrics, which I think are two of the bigger areas that have research tracks. You're seeing more developed in pathology, neurology, and even actually in some places where they have just a general residency-based program, you're seeing people from surgical specialties, emergency medicine, pursuing extra research time in their residency so that they kind of are finding a way to balance those pieces in their lives. So the more questions that you can kind of think about what this career looks like, I think the better off you're going to be. And those are actually some of the pieces that I regret for myself, that I didn't put that foresight into it, simply because a lot of it I just didn't know to think about.
And one of the things I would say is having known you and having seen your professional growth, is that the importance of mentorship along the way. And I think as you found your stride in your research, you also, you can almost time that to when you really develop those deep mentor relationships. So that's something to consider about as well as you're thinking about this process. And the other thing I would say, and not to put words in your mouth, is we with the Tour for Diversity in Medicine have benefited from your PhD background because there's a lot of transferable skills that you've been able to take from your knowledge base that you've had with your PhD and bring it over to help us with the work that we're doing with the tour. Travelle, I want to go to you. As someone who's finished with training and in the workforce, how do you incorporate both of your degrees in the work that you do? How does that MD and PhD both show up when you're in the meetings that you're in?
Yeah, so I really want to pick up on something you just said, Dr. Landry, and that is transferable skills. We invest a lot of time as scientists, but I think the root of it, thinking back to where I was in the application process, it was all about being curious, right? It wasn't that I want to cure this kind of cancer, and some people are that committed and focused, but as an undergrad or a postbac or someone that's about to apply, it's really, I am curious about solving this. Like, I'm curious about having an impact and getting dirty and answering questions and being relentless to the pursuit of science. And I think that's what differentiates an MD versus a PhD, or MD just solely versus an MD PhD, right? Is that extra commitment to say, I want to understand the why. And I think I struggled with that in medical school because it wasn't, I always teased with like, well, it's not just one answer. Like there's a lot of reasons behind it. And as we talk about the reasons why patients can't get the care they need, we are now talking about social determinants and things that are just like so much broader than just that one disease state. And so I bring that to the MD-PhD conversation because that PhD is the time to explore your passions. It is the time to explore your whys, and it is the time to clarify your whys. I'll never forget that, you know, I joined my lab because I thought what they did was cool, right? Like I did research all 4 years of undergrad during my summers, and I didn't have a ton of publications, but I had enough transferable skills that I rolled into my candidacy for MD PhD that, you know, I had run my own studies, I had presented data at conferences, and I had a lot of failures. And I think leveraging those failures to where you want to go is just as important as saying, I've achieved, I've achieved, I've achieved. I bring up failures because my story is one of resilience, and that, you know, I left my MD PhD program without matching in clinical medicine. And I think when we hit the door of medical school, it's, I'm going to get a residency in this. And I ended up graduating without a residency. And so I am thankful for my MD PhD process because I was able to leverage my PhD to get me in the door of industry. So I left Wisconsin with an MD PhD in biomedical engineering. And I was in a very low place because I wanted to be a surgeon. I was ride or die, I'm going to be a surgeon. And it wasn't the case that I could be a surgeon. And so my first job, my first true job, I took a job in nonprofit doing education because that's a passion of mine. But my first true job was with a orthopedics company. And I was what they called a medical science liaison. And my job was to educate surgeons on stem cells and the use in orthopedic cartilage repair. And it was a perfect fusion of what I did in my lab as a PhD student, as well as combining medicine, because to have these conversations with surgeons, you had to have that advanced degree. You had to be a physician. And so while I wasn't paid like my peers coming out of residency, and we'll talk about finances probably later, but you know, I felt like I was perfectly suited to do what I was doing because of my training. And I'm thankful for my MD PhD process for that, because presenting your research from your lab, that late night hours, thinking about how I'm going to prepare for lab meeting tomorrow because I don't know what I'm going to say because this is some garbage results, right? And really being honest with yourself and like your process, like what did I do wrong in this step? What could I have done better? What materials don't I have? What questions do I still have? How can I rephrase this scientific hypothesis such that I'm really answering the question I want to answer? So while I'm not really being direct, I think the point is that across the 8, and I spent 10 years, across the 7, 8, 9, 10 years that you're doing this degree, you're really refining yourself. You're really refining the way you're thinking. And you're really refining the way that you will potentially interface the world. So fast forward to present, I'm a director at a medical diagnostic company, Exact Sciences. It's an amazing company. And I sit in meetings where we talk about research evidence and how, you know, the inclusion criteria for studies that we pay billions of dollars for may not be reaching the outcomes we want because we don't have the correct baselines. And so that is, again, a use of my MD and my PhD in a very real world application. And I don't know that I would pick that for myself, right? I wanted to be a surgeon. And so all of this to say that if you are gung-ho about science, you like asking questions, you like being relentless for answers. Yes, 8 years is a long time, for me 10, but now, you know, I get to do something that I love and I'm having a great time doing it.
Awesome, thank you for that. And really thank you for sharing your story, because I think it's important for us to recognize that it doesn't always go as smoothly as you anticipated, but you know, you were positive and you were persistent and you persevered. And not to use too many P's, but I'm just impressed by witnessing your journey over the years, knowing you and seeing where you are now and how you're impactful in the spaces that you operate. Switching gears a little bit, I want to go back to you, Tamina. As we are thinking about institutions and finding a home and being in the right place, what factors did you use to determine which medical school would be the best fit for you for your MD PhD program?
Yeah, there were a number of them. The first things first, the foundation was the training. So looking at the medical school side, what is the success rates of the students? Like how many of them end up going to residency? What kind of residencies are they matching into? So that was like the medical school piece. And then it was also the PhD piece. The kinds of research I wanted to do. I wanted to do immunology. I am doing immunology. How many immunologists are there like in that institution? Like I can't just pick an institution with just 2 or 3. I might not get into those labs. So what is the breadth in terms of the research I find myself most interested in? And then looking specifically at the MD PhD program, looking at the success of the students in that program. And it's not an issue to reach out to the program administration themselves. Like there have been students that are interested in coming to Harvard that have reached out to program administration and they've connected me with them. So we sit down over a phone call and you actually get to talk to the students and understand specifically from a student perspective what that community is like. How much support do you have? How fast are the students graduating? You know, like what is it like to be a student at this institution? So that's the training piece. Then I looked at the curriculum. So there's some schools that still give grades. I did not like grades. I did not want to start doing A, B, C. I left that in undergrad. So I was like, I want to find a pass-fail curriculum where I'm more focused on learning and it feels a little bit more collaborative because I'm not competing or like trying to figure out grade type things. I'm just like focused on learning and getting the most of the information. And I don't have this pressure on me. So I wanted a pass-fail curriculum. And then I also wanted something that wasn't very lecture-based. If I could miss a class in undergrad, I usually did because I didn't want to have to sit down in a lecture. I prefer just like learning at my own pace. And there's schools like Harvard that have a more informal, sort of like a case-based collaborative system, as opposed to sit down on a lecture and have someone talk to you for like 45 minutes to an hour. People learn different ways. So whatever works for you, go for that. So it was training, it was curriculum, it was also community for me. It's a long path, as it has been mentioned, you know, so like thinking about where my friends are, where my family is, I will need those people over the course of those 8 years. So being in proximity to those people, I felt was particularly important to me. And I had some friends in Boston, so that really helped out. I'm an international student, as I mentioned earlier, so funding was also another one. There are not that many MD PhD programs that fund international students at a consistent rate. So I found all of them, applied to all of them, and that helped increase my chances. And then lastly, just like, where would you like to live? Like for those 8 years, do you want to be in Boston? Do you want to be in LA? Like all of those things like factor in because it's a longer path. So I consider training, curriculum, community, funding, and location. And small point, Travelle, like you hit a chord when you mentioned lab meeting, because I just had my first lab meeting yesterday and it was it was fun. Let's just put it that way.
So it sounds like your experiences are universal when you're on the MD PhD track, where there's what Travelle experienced. You know, you felt her pain in your first meeting. I love it. You know, one of the things that you mentioned, Tamina, is the importance of thinking about you as an individual and what you would be comfortable with, because you're right, it's a long journey and you want to be in a place where you will be happy. Not just from an educational standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, because you're going to grow over these 8 to 9 years as an individual, but then you also are going to grow professionally as you matriculate through school. So I think it's really important that people think about, it's not just the name of the institution, it's not just it's not sort of all those things that we think about from a professional standpoint, but there's a personal standpoint, because this is almost a decade of your life. All right. Travelle, you mentioned this earlier. You talked about your research experience back in undergrad. As you reflect back on your journey, how important was that exposure to research as an undergrad to help you make this decision that an MD PhD was the right program for you?
Yeah, for me, research was critical. So I went to Pitt for undergrad, And I came in thinking I was going to be biology pre-med, you know, what they preach when you go to college. And I got to my second semester biology classes and I hated it. Like I knew I wanted to be a doctor, but I hated just like sitting through class, memorizing something and like writing on a test. Like I just felt like it was impersonal. I wasn't really connecting and I just didn't really like reading. I hate to say that, but so for me in undergrad, I felt like once I found out you didn't have to major in biology to go to med school, I was like, okay, let me go through this catalog. And back then it was on paper, so that tells you kind of how old I am. But let me go through this catalog and figure out what I actually like. And so I grew up, my dad's an engineer, and he was always like, oh, you never want to be an engineer, blah, blah, blah. But I actually took an engineering class and loved it, right? So I got to play with things. I got to do math and solve problems. And so I ended up switching from College of Arts and Sciences to engineering. And that was kind of the best thing I ever did, because even though I was in biomedical engineering, I was having fun, I was getting good grades, and I was still meeting my pre-med requirements. And it was in my BME curriculum that we had a seminar one night about the artificial heart. And my eyes were just wide open about what was going on and the technology and how you were able to save people's life when they had, you know, intermittent myocardial infarctions, et cetera. And so that really put me on the path of MD-PhD, because I felt like as a BME grad, I probably wouldn't be able to do much with my undergrad without going to grad school. And I knew I wanted to be a physician, and I felt like I wasn't qualified to do both unless I got more training. And so undergrad was just a fun time. Once I figured that out, undergrad got to be fun. I got to hang out with friends. I got to do things I really liked. And then I was just very strategic about the classes I took, what credits they fulfilled, and how I paid for it. So I wanted to go abroad. I figured that at my school at that time, if you took a fifth year, your scholarship could extend. So that also played into my plan of MD-PhD, because you have to have more research time. So I was just very strategic by that point to find something I liked, research things that, you know, I went to the big name labs. I went to the orthopedic lab. I did a radiology lab because I was like, do I like this? So really have fun with your undergrad years, you know, take the courses that interest you, that also fulfill requirements, don't waste time, but also find labs that, or research questions that might also be very cool. You know, you may not want to go to the rockstar lab because you're an undergrad, you're going to be washing dishes, you're going to be, you know, pipetting solutions. Find somebody that's going to teach you and expose you to things that are cool, that you can tell a story about later. So even if it's not your name's on 5 papers, it's, I really got to integrate really well into this community. I worked well with others, because really that letter that comes from the person you work for is just as strong as, to me, as some of the publications.
Interesting. You know, I want to turn to you, Robert, because as we talked about earlier, your path was a little different and you didn't enter as an MD PhD student. As you think about your journey, what are some of the pros and cons of doing a traditional MSTP program versus starting a PhD once you've already entered into medical school?
Yeah, so, you know, like I said, I didn't have any research experience before. So Travelle talking about those things sounds like a great thing I should have thought about. But what I got to do with my time was start to realize in med school that there was something more that I wanted to do. And I didn't know what it was at the time. And I just saw research as one thing to try. And really what that PhD time opened up for me was an opportunity to not just work on those skills from the PhD training, but I also spent a lot of time working on education. That's how I got involved with the tour, and I've been with Alden in that group for, you know, nearly a decade now at this point in time. And so what it allowed me to do was have that flexibility in my schedule to start to think about, what did I want out of my career? How was I going to use these skills? How was I going to start to shape what I wanted to do in academic medicine? And so while I had a pretty steep learning curve, because I didn't come in with, you know, many traditional research skills, so I had to learn a lot on the job. My lab itself was primarily mechanical engineers. So it was a lot of tinkering with our cartilage device and learning on the fly of how to fix it when the motor went down, things like that. But then also having to learn the biology part of it and kind of utilize other labs to help train myself. So what it really gave me that chance to do was learn how to network. How do I talk and coordinate with other people And that was actually a big part of my training because, you know, my PhD advisor, he was a mechanical engineer by nature. And so when I would go and talk to him in meetings about, you know, PCR findings, I was often having to do some teaching with him to be like, this is where we're going with this, and this is what it means. So that was a very helpful skill to learn. One of the other things I think that I liked about my time, and this is pro and a con for me actually, was the fact that I didn't have other MD PhD students around me. So I didn't do this at an MSTP program. Rush itself hadn't had a dual degree student for a number of years before I joined the anatomy department as a PhD student. So I didn't have other people to go off and look at what they were doing. So it really forced me to find the community through other student organizations, which is how I found some groups within SMA, within LMSA, Physician Scientists Association, like I mentioned. And so that also added to that networking piece. And the con part of that was just in my own institution, it became a struggle to figure out how do I navigate this world because, you know, I was there for 10 years. And so I had faculty who had seen people who I was in med school with graduate med school, go into residency, graduate residency, become attendings, and they're still seeing me as the student involved in a lot of these different areas of what we were doing. So figuring out how to navigate that was something I had to learn on the fly for myself. And I think the other piece that, you know, question that came up in the chat too, just the funding is different. You know, MSTP versus non-MSTP, it can be very different environments. You know, I think in the non-MSTP world, the non-medical sciences training side, you have a wide range of what schools will provide. Some will have full rides in situations very similar or comparable to an MSTP track, but others will have, you know, maybe some guaranteed funding for your PhD time, and that's about it. And so some of those resources that I mentioned before with the AAMC and AACOMAS will have that information on there about what the funding looks like for some of the non-MSTP places, but that is definitely a consideration that people make. For me, it wasn't an option because I did my PhD training where I was already enrolled as a medical student. So my application process was very different, but it was still something that I had to, you know, think about what were the ramifications of this decision, especially because, you know, what we thought was going to be a 3-year PhD turned into 5 years. So that was, you know, a couple of extra years that I had to work on that part and also think about how that impacted my family, with my wife being in her own residency training and then into her career, and what that did also with our family life as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And also just, again, highlighting the fact that you, in all of this process of your MD, PhD, life still happened for you. Marriage, then transition to, after medical school, family. And so life still happens during this course that you're going through over the 10 years. And I think people often think that, you know, you're in this vacuum when you're in your education and your training, and that's not the reality. The world is still happening. So it's also important to think about those aspects. So thank you for sharing that. Tamina, what do you hope to do with your MD PhD? And I don't want to put you into a box. I know you still have some time to grow and you got to get back into your clinical rotations and figure out which specialty you want to go into, or you may not decide to go into residency. I don't know. But what do you hope to do, and how do you think the PhD will affect your contribution into whatever field that you decide to go into?
Thanks for that, Alvin. And like our program director is here now, so I'm also like, what's the right answer? You know? But I would say my plan is still very much evolving. And I feel like that's the beauty of this program, is like you have two of the most, in my opinion at least, diverse degrees you can get, providing you with very transferable skills, providing you with all of this new information that you now have at your disposal. So very, very much evolving. For now, I know that I definitely still want to see patients, and the curriculum at HMS gives you time to actually do most, at least my program, gives you do most of your clinical rotations before you start your PhD. So you actually get to see if you enjoy being in the hospital and actually get the sense of what a doctor really does. So I know I still want to see patients, but I'm pretty confident I want that to be part-time. I'm strongly considering doing the typical physician scientist, more 80-20 type splits, where you spend most of your time in lab and then some time seeing patients. But I'm also increasingly thinking of biotech. I've gotten a little bit of experience now in biotech. I love the pace of it. I love all these very creative, very intelligent people coming together and working on this idea, this question, and moving very, very quickly to try and get the solution. I love the competitive nature of things. So very much considering biotech as well. And that's where I would say I've kind of landed. But as we've mentioned, the PhD gives you time to explore. So I'm going to try and pursue opportunities, fellowships at like biotech companies, pursue opportunities in industry, consider consulting, and really make sure I use this time to get a sense of what truly like harnesses my strengths, but also like my interests. So evolving story.
Wonderful. Well, I'm looking forward to see how it plays out for you. I will say this. I think you mentioned a unicorn of this 80-20 split. I know everybody's always in search of it. So hopefully you find that unicorn of an 80-20 split as well. So just I want to answer a couple of the questions that are popping up in the Q&A. We won't be able to get to them all, and hopefully some of our panelists can try and answer them once they're finished with the panel, and maybe unpack a few more of those questions. But I guess a question, we're talking to pre-meds here, and one of the things that they're often thinking about is, when to apply, whether they should think about doing gap years, growth years, gap seasons, whatever the term is, before applying. Is that something that you would encourage people to do? And I'll go to you, Robert, for this one.
Yeah, I think ultimately when it comes to your timing of your application, it's you figure out what works best for you. Make sure that you're as prepared as possible. You're through the MD PhD side, you're applying to both. And so keeping in mind what's going to make you a strong medical school applicant may differ than what will make you a strong PhD applicant. So if you need that extra time to build your research experiences, because it's becoming ever more important when it comes to the PhD side of the dual degree training, do that. If you feel that your clinical experiences are needing to be strengthened, find ways to volunteer, things like that. But you really need to just figure out where do you sit with your strength as an applicant for the dual degree and time it with what works best for that.
Great.
I would agree with that. I took a fifth year in undergrad, and that was the best thing for me, right? I was able to maintain my scholarship. I didn't have to go find a job. So financially, it just worked out, but that's not everybody's, situation.
Travelle, any other thoughts about timing of all of this? Not just the application, but just thinking about the process in general?
Yeah, I think you have to be very flexible with the timing of MD PhD. I think in thinking about traditional, it's going to be 8 years of my life. What happens when it's 10, right? I joined a very aggressive lab, which without really thinking that nobody gets out of here with a PhD in under 5 years. So I'm going to be in my program for 9. And then in deciding to do more health policy and social justice and leadership things, that added another year. So be okay with this isn't going to necessarily go as I have planned today on June 10th, 2021, right? You're committing yourself to growth, to a process that's going to be bigger than you. Your research, if you work with people, you have to show up when they show up. If you work with mice and the mice can't come in, like your timeline changes. And so you can't, I just think that we're all very type A and we want things to go the way that we want them to go. And I just want to make sure that you guys are patient and give yourself some grace in this process.
Thank you. And I'll go to our student doctor for the final word. Tamina, as you are hearing this conversation, you're in the throes of the process, and there's a number of pre-med students here who are thinking about this space. Is there anything else that these students should be considering as they are about to enter into this journey of an MD PhD?
I would say for me, it's like getting a sense of your why, really like getting a stronger sense of the why you want to do this, because I'm in my 4th year now, so I'm about halfway through, I guess. It's a long process and it's a difficult process. So like understanding that why you want to do this, and not a specific thing, like I want to cure this very specific disease, but like, as Travelle kind of mentioned, like a bigger curiosity for things you want to gain from this experience. I feel that's what it really kind of helps me through. And like, particularly looking at this past year we've had where everything kind of just got thrown like off balance, right? Like my clinical training was a little bit like to be determined and so on, you know, like that why helps you push through and stay on track, at least mentally, in the sense, because my why is bigger than I want an MD PhD. My why is I want to help my patients physically, but I also want to help patients I've never even seen. These are the skills I need to gain in that process. And like, I'm going to accumulate those skills over time. It might not come when I want it, as Travelle mentioned, but like pursuing that path of being a continual learner allows me to continue to persevere through it. So, and like getting a sense of that why, and then like figuring out, working backwards to understand all the small pieces that need to go in place in order for you to actually achieve those goals, I think is critical.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you all to the three panelists for your candid answers. We're going to switch to our next panel, but I just want to say thank you to Dr. Travelle Ellis, thank you to Dr. Robert Trevino, and thank you to Tamina Keinka. It's just really important to hear your voices as we talk about this. And hopefully you can stick around and try and answer a few questions that popped up in the Q&A. I know there were some that were particularly targeted to each of you just because of the comments that you made. We're going to transition to our next panel. We talked about the why, and now we're going to talk about the actual application process itself. And we're going to hear from a few experts who can really help us to better understand what the process looks like, thinking about the decisions that go along with who's a good candidate, how to present yourself in the best light in order to be successful in matching into or being accepted into an MD PhD program. So first is Dr. Silvia Corvera. She is a professor and program in molecular medicine and endowed chair in diabetes research and the director of the MD PhD program at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Next is Dr. Talia Swartz. She's Associate Dean for the MD PhD Education and Assistant Professor of Medicine, Infectious Disease, and Assistant Professor of Medical Education at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And last is Dr. Loren Walensky. He is the Director of the Harvard MIT MD PhD Program and Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, an attending physician in pediatric oncology at Boston Children's Hospital, and principal investigator of the LIN program and cancer chemical biology, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Thank you all for joining us for the panel. And my first question to you, Silvia, is we heard from some students and from a student and to graduates of an MD PhD program. But I wanted to hear your thoughts as someone who's on the admission side. What should a student be considering when deciding on an MD PhD program versus either an MD or a PhD independently?
Yeah, that's well, first of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on this panel and the opportunity to see my colleagues and to talk to all aspiring candidates. We really talented physician scientists, and I hope this panel is useful to you as you consider that as your future career. So who should apply to an MD PhD program? You know, I think obviously this is my personal viewpoint, but I think the MD PhD is really ideal for students who are really interested in research that's aimed at improving human health and alleviating suffering. Because, you know, as an MD, you have that opportunity to, you know, directly observe the disease process, you know, the disease as it manifests in different individuals. And so you have that ability to think of questions that are really directly relevant to the medical problems that you're seeing. And it's really important to recognize that, you know, there are a lot of nuances to diseases. So, you know, and you don't find these nuances in experimental model systems. So for example, in my personal interest area, which is diabetes, you know, human variation is a critical part of it. So, you know, how much fat you have and where it is as a person makes a huge difference, and you're never going to see that in a mouse. And so, you don't see that outside the clinic. And so I feel that, but your identity as a physician helps you formulate those questions better. And then as a scientist, you're constantly learning and evaluating new knowledge and new technologies. You can see whether there's a direct application to medicine, not only of your own research, but other research. You know, say that you're somebody that's working on artificial intelligence and you see that somebody's developing these algorithms, and you know, you can immediately see, wow, this would be great to apply this for radiology or for pathology. Maybe the physicist or the scientist that's working on those algorithms doesn't know that, but as a physician, you know that right away. And so I think that a physician scientist can both ways. You see the great questions, you know how to formulate the research, and then you see the research and you know how to bring it back. So, but that's very intensive, and you know, it occupies a lot of your time. So I think you really have to be interested in humans and human health. In my view, this is where this program really is good for you.
Awesome. And I think just being able to take it out of the lab and into the practice is what's really important. Thank you for that. Talia, is there a such thing as an ideal candidate for an MD PhD program? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, thanks also for having me. And I'm so excited to have this discussion. I think there is no such thing as one cookie cutter ideal candidate. I think part of the beauty of the diversity of candidates, and especially as we are deeply needing to expand sort of the lens and the diversity of the physician scientist pipeline, we need to be thinking about problems from many different perspectives. And that means in understanding the patient populations that we're serving. And it means understanding science from different perspectives. And so all of those pieces are important in sort of multiple different people coming into this from different places, sharing some common themes. And so, you know, it's really important that if you're embarking on this very long career path, that you're really passionate and excited about science and medicine, and you really want to have demonstrated through your experiences that you have an understanding of what's involved, that you've been engaged in, you know, human disease through either clinical exposures or, you know, service work, and understand why you would be interested in doing this for your career. And that from the science perspective, that you're really passionate about answering questions and being able to innovate in ways that will improve the human condition. It's also important that you are okay with failure, because as we heard from the previous panelists, that is part of this experience, that science is filled with failures. They are often devastating and often really critical in being able to help us pivot and understand questions from different perspectives. So being fascinated and creative and persistent, sort of the idea of this tenacity of having failed, recognizing that the problems will happen along the way, and being able to learn from that and use that as far, instead of it defeating you, using it to fuel your future directions. And then all of those are sort of the traits, the things that you bring into this. And then what you do in making up sort of your candidacy is figuring out, these are the things that drive you. Do you understand, you know, what the different options are? And there are, you know, definitely options in terms of the MD track and the PhD track and the MD-PhD track. You want to get a sense. You want to have spoken with those who've gone through it and see whether their experiences are similar to yours. Nobody's will be identical, but whether there are themes that are common to things that make you passionate, and help you sort of view yourself as someone who wants to go through this pathway that kind of necessarily requires this dual training, because you can accomplish so much with either one degree. And so in making yourself an ideal candidate, you want to prove that your own personal narrative makes it really important that you pursue this dual pathway to accomplish your career goals.
Awesome. You know, one of the things we say on the Tour for Diversity is, I have a story, you need to hear my story. And it sounds like you're telling people to have a story and be willing and ready to share their story to help it simple and plain as to why they're choosing this direction for a career. So thank you for sharing that. Which leads to my next question for you, Loren. What is the application process for an MD PhD program, and how is that process different than applying strictly to medical school?
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. It's a true pleasure to be here. I am such a fan of this career track, and I have to say I'm as excited about it when I first applied myself to how I feel today. I feel like I just hit the jackpot with picking the best possible career that I could have gone into, and blending my love for taking care of children and, you know, attacking and with them, you know, pediatric cancers, and then bringing that back to the lab and understanding chemoresistance pathways and cell death pathways, and doing experimental therapeutics. And so I am just like, I remain so incredibly happy that I chose this path. And it's just been such a beautiful kind of combination of heart and mind, you know, in everything that we get to do every day. So I just wanted to start with that opening statement. But in terms of your question, which I think is an important one, is, you know, what is this process? And, you know, you can't really apply with a mindset of, you know, one without the other. It's really a dual degree application. And, you know, we care as much about the MD component as the PhD component. And so, you know, everything that you're going to be conveying, you know, in the medical school part about what you're like as a humanist, you know, why you want to take care of people, what you've done to show us that you really care and have taken care of people, and why you want to dedicate countless hours of your life worrying about other people's problems and how to fix them in real time. That's very important to convey. And then on the research side, it's why do you want to do research, and how do you want to specifically blend it with that other side of yourself? You know, I always say that, like, kind of being an MD PhD is somewhat schizophrenic in the sense that, you know, on the one hand, you're trying to achieve this sameness, this like gold standard of what it's like to be the best possible surgeon, the best possible physician, and to meet that standard and achieve that level of sameness so that you can do that surgery just as good or maybe even better than the gold standard. And on the other side of it, you want to be as absolutely different as you could possibly be from anyone that's ever come before you, right? So those are two very different things, and you get to have both of those instincts, you know, in the MD PhD career. So on the PhD side of the application, you know, what are we looking for? We're looking forward to people that have really invested their time in deep dives in research, you know, and what has that meant? You know, that has meant that they have, you know, stuck with a laboratory sometimes and really, you know, spent a good part of their college career, you know, really trying to understand the problems, learning the skills in that laboratory to be able to become as independent as you could possibly be as an undergraduate. And then apply. I mean, what do we look for? We want to know that you have the potential to really hit home runs in scientific breakthroughs, right? So, you know, how do you convey that, you know, in an application? It's basically, you know, what have you done? How have you spent your time? And if you really dug in and have accomplished amazing things, you know, in the lab and in different research arenas, that means that you love it and that you want to keep doing it. And this may have come up, you know, Alden, in the last 45 minutes, but so many times people say, like, well, should I do this now or should I do it later? Right? Like, you could do it now, you know, as part of an MD PhD, or you could really do amazing research and train in research as a fellow, right? Like after your residency, when you pick your specialty and you train clinically for a year or two, and then you go into the lab full time. And maybe we have time, we can get into that. But I mean, it's, you know, my answer is, the last example is kind of delayed gratification. Like, if you love something, why are you putting it off for 7 years? And so if you love research that much, then gosh, like, you don't want to wait 7 years to get back in there with unfettered research time. With an MD PhD, you can like dive right back in there in a year and a half and just be doing it, you know, in your 20s. So I think the main part of the application is to convey your passion for both of these things by, you know, showing us what you have done and excelling in both arenas. And that gives us the kind of confidence that you have the potential to really hit it out of the park.
So thank you. And just as a quick question, when you're going through and you're about to apply, is it the same as clicking a button on AMCAS and saying I want an MD PhD as opposed to just an MD, or how does that even look from a logistical standpoint when you're doing the application process?
Yeah,
Lauren?
my other colleagues can add into it. I mean, you definitely get the choice to apply to MD PhD, and then that brings on usually extra questions
Sure.
and secondary applications where different schools will ask you for different information, whether it be a publication, record, which is obviously not essential, but always a bonus, and different essays as to why you want to have the dual degree and different things to convey.
Awesome. And we'll get to the other panels, but I actually have a question for you, Silvia. I was looking at the matriculating student questionnaire that came out from the AAMC, and it said about 58% of medical students enter medical school with either undergraduate or post-baccalaureate research experience.
Mhm.
How important is that type of experience if you're applying to MD PhD programs? And the second part of the question, which I think I really want to hone in on, is how does that compare to other traditional activities that pre-meds try and focus in on to beef up their application, such as shadowing or community service or leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it relates directly to what we just heard from Dr. Walensky. The reason that those research experience statements are important, and also the track record in the application, is because it makes us, from the admission side, make sure from the applicant side what you're getting yourself into. To the MD PhD career is the beginning of a lifelong process as a physician scientist. And it's really only sustainable if you have a really strong passion and vocation for research. And so and that's not going to all of a sudden happen, the day that you write your application. That is probably something that's in you from many, many years before. If you were like a little kid pestering your parents all the time, asking them why this, why that, or how this, how that, do you have that natural curiosity? Then that means that, during your undergraduate education, you probably did things that were related to that, and that you can show that with. And so those undergraduate experiences are telling us, do you have the curiosity? Do you have the creativity? Do you have a lot of endurance? Because you need to be used to being wrong over and over again. And also, do you have a commitment to enhance human health? And you can have that commitment to human health in many, many ways, but not necessarily coupled, to the curiosity and the creativity, and that you need for research, for real innovation. And so that's what we look for. It's not like we're filling boxes, or it's not like brownie points. It's do you really know that you love this? And if you do, show us. Was it before? Was it when you're in elementary school? Was it during your undergraduate career? Or maybe you didn't have a chance for all sorts of reasons to be able to pursue what you love, and you did a post-bac at the NIH or at BU, and there you're really blossoming, and we can see it in your application that you're loving the research part, and that's what we're looking for. So it's more to prevent the applicant, from going into a path that you really don't want. That is really not where you're going to shine.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's important for us to think about the commitment that goes along to a career as an MD PhD. Our prior panelists talked about that 8-year, sometimes 10-year commitment as a student, as a candidate for your PhD and a medical student, and to make sure that you are entering into this process with a clear mind. And I think it's really important that you have that background exposure. It doesn't necessarily need to be that you've published 6 papers, but you have to have an understanding of what a career in research may be, and a career in medicine as a practicing physician, and how you can think about this. So thank you for sharing that. Which goes to my next question. This is for you, Talia. We talked about these statements of purpose, statements of research. What are the key components that students should be putting into a key part of their application to medical school, which is a personal statement as an MD PhD applicant?
Yeah, I think a lot of the answer to that question is in what Dr. Corvera just said about the passion, about your why, and it's a lot about where this inspiration came from. It's, you know, the more personal, the better, and not to divulge anything that you don't feel comfortable discussing. But everyone does come to this for different reasons, and what your own motivations are for this are helpful in giving you the strength to endure or enjoy or both this long training. And the training is long up until you get your degrees. It's actually quite a bit longer after that as well. And so with residency and fellowship and postdoctoral training and all that, it's quite a long time. And so part of that is actually a commitment to the journey along the way and what it is that fascinates you about doing this every day, despite the challenges, despite the failures, despite the fact that it's hard. Your personal statement should come through about why this is what you want to do, no matter what, even though there are going to be so many challenges that come up. And so if you can describe some of those challenges, even better, as to how you've confronted experiences in your life where things have been hard, but because of your tenacity, you've been able to overcome them. It's great for you to be able to describe the motivation, your sort of personal experiences and motivated both in science and in medicine. And then just end, you know, I like sort of the beginning, middle, and end, where you end and sort of, these are my goals. This is what I want to accomplish. And this is what this training program is going to help me to do. And it's great if it can be unique and it's in your voice. And it's, I recommend getting as much feedback from others as possible. Does this sound like me? Does this sound, you know, authentic to who I am and what my goals are? And if you have trouble writing this, that it just doesn't sound like you're really committed to it, then that's very helpful, because maybe that's not what you're committed to. And as you're going through the application process, you may learn that actually this is too much and it's not what I want to do. But in fact, the thing that I'm really passionate about, the thing that gets me excited as I'm writing this, is clinical medicine and not the science, or the science and actually not the clinical medicine. And so the application process, which is quite a big process, because not only is it the AMCAS process, but everything in those secondary applications that Dr. Walensky was describing, which ask you about the science that you want to do, and also specifics about the institution, potential mentors, and how your scientific interests may align with that institution. That's a lot. And if you're finding the whole thing to be exhausting and sort of not inspiring for you, then that is very telling. On the other hand, as you're looking through the programs to see what work is getting done, and you're really fueled by that, then that is, you know, helpful in informing the fact that you'll be able to endure this long training, because it's worth it, not only for the destination, but sort of the journey all the way through.
I think that was really good advice. Thank you for sharing. You know, if you can't get excited when writing your personal statement, then that should be a red flag for you. And so if you're not excited about the work and it doesn't convey onto the paper, the ideas may be there. Getting the words out may be a little difficult. That's completely different than actually being excited about the process of becoming. And so I think teasing out those two is important. But yes, I 100% agree. If you're struggling to write it because you don't have that passion about it, then that should be a red flag. So thank you for sharing. And then also, just word to the wise, have other people read that. I love that advice. Have other people read that, because they can hear, is this you? Is this something that you've talked about? Is this something that you're passionate about? And then I can also pick up on those spelling and grammar errors that you may have overlooked as well. Loren, just sort of rounding out the thought about the application process, whether it's the shadowing, the research exposure, the personal statement, another key component of this is letters of recommendation. When students are thinking about getting those letters of recommendation for their application to an MD PhD program, who should they be seeking letters from? How much of that letter should be focused on research versus clinical medicine? And should someone who is who has a focus on research be a primary letter writer?
I think that these letters are really important. And the challenge with letters is that you don't know how people write. and you don't know how they're going to write about you necessarily. So you can do the best you can to try to pick who you think are the folks that know you the absolute best, because guaranteed you're going to get a better letter from someone, or more descriptive letter, more detailed personal letter from someone that you think really knows you. So I think the first criteria in my mind is find the person that you think is a champion for you and who really knows you the best, right? You know, that's critical. There's some things, there's many things in this process that you can't control, including how your selected letter writer is actually going to write about you. So you have to do the best that you can. So my thoughts on this are, when in doubt, go with the person that knows you the best. Then you want to take advantage of the letter writing, you know, to have folks write about different dimensions of who you are. So if you're applying to an MD-PhD program, yeah, you want to convey that you are a passionate, you know, empathetic, you know, other-oriented person, and so a logical person to go to for that is someone that you may have done shadowing with, or someone who you may have done volunteerism with, or someone who may have been your supervisor in EMS and has seen you working with patients and have seen you stay up all night, you know, dedicated to, you know, running out in the middle of the night when the bell goes off, and so that would be, you know, showcasing your clinical side. You know, on the research side, clearly you want to go with someone who you have spent the most time with in the lab, who you had the most conversations with in their lab, whether that be a summer mentor and ideally a kind of full-time, you know, college, you know, mentor, someone who you worked with in the lab during your college career. And then, you know, you're going to want to go for someone who can speak to your academic, you know, prowess. And there again, it can be tricky, because if you've taken one course with one professor and you sat there with 250 other students, and you got an A+, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that that letter is going to, you know, make me as a reader jump out of my seat if, you know, the faculty member says, yeah, they got an A+ in my class, but then there's not that much more, right? So I think it's so important to focus on the people that know you. And then if you have special talents and you've done something unique, whether it be you're a classical pianist that's played with the local symphony, and you know your piano coach or your piano teacher has been with you, you know, all throughout college, then sure, you know, throw in, you know, that aspect of your personality, whether it be a coach or a musical mentor. But I think the really key thing to convey, which is why I keep repeating it, is make sure that you feel that these people that you're going to pick really know you the best and really have your back and are your ultimate cheerleaders of all the list of possibilities. Because, you know, for better or for worse, some of these letters, you know, if they're not really done in a caring way, or if it looks like someone just, you know, said he instead of she because they're just copying and pasting, and God forbid if they actually put someone else's first name in there and it's not really you. I mean, someone that really cares is not going to do that. You know, I can tell you, when I write a recommendation letter, I read it over multiple times before I send it in, because I know that it matters, and these letters do matter. So I would take these decisions very seriously.
And that's really important, because most of the time I hear students and they're debating about who to get letters of recommendation from. They think that they need to go to the most senior person in the department, or someone who is a full professor, as opposed to someone who's early in their career. And that distance in their years in training, although they may be more senior, that may lead to just them not having that same personal relationship with you, because they may be distant and they may not be the one that can actually speak to your talents the best. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important that we tease out who are the people that are going to be our best advocates, and those are probably going to be those strongest of letters of support when you're building your application. So Silvia, this question has come up a few times in our chat, in our Q&A. Most people, including myself when I was a pre-med student, thought that an MD PhD meant basic sciences, pipetting, playing with mice, electrophoresis, things like that. What opportunities are there for those applicants who are interested in medicine and the social sciences, whether it be anthropology, social medicine, epidemiology, public health?
Yeah, you know, this is a really important question, and nowadays more important than ever. And I think the best way to address it is to help think, what do we know about a disease? What do we know about illness? And so one of the ways that we separate out in our program, we try to understand it based on 4 different pillars, right? And so the first pillar asks the question, who gets this disease? Is it more prevalent in some parts of the world? Is it more prevalent in folks living in urban settings versus rural settings? Is it related to where there's pollution? Is it endemic? Is it an epidemic? Is it a virus? Is it spreading? How is it spreading? Should we make a mask? Should we make mosquito nets? And so this is all epidemiology, and it's absolutely critical for us in terms of understanding disease. And I think the COVID pandemic really showed us the importance of that area of research. And then the second pillar is knowledge about cellular and molecular events. What's happening in our cells? Are they proliferating abnormally, like in cancer? Why? Which ones are getting infected again with COVID, right? Why is it that people are getting heart symptoms? And so that's more the classical basic science MD PhD area of research. But then there's a whole other pillar, which is mitigation of disease, right? How do we mitigate? So we typically focus on treatments, right? We want to find a treatment. We want to find a cure. But it's equally important to prevent the disease. And so we need to more research into approaches that prevent the disease from happening in the first place. And what are the risk factors? What are the social determinants of health? How do we develop these new treatments and cures and preventative approaches? These are equally important. And so these, and very central to the mission of a physician scientist. And then the fourth that I think we're recognizing more and more is justice, right? So who gets to be treated? Who has access to the knowledge and the resources that you need to prevent disease? What are cultural barriers? For example, in vaccine acceptance. How does our society treat those with a disease? How do we treat people that are at risk? What are our policies? How do we improve or change our policies? Who makes these policies? And physician scientists can have a tremendous impact on justice in medicine. And so, as I feel I've alluded to, the MD PhD programs should be able to provide, appropriate training and research opportunities in these 4 big pillars of disease. And I think all of us all program directors are very conscious of this need. And we strive to reach that level of comprehensive training. And we absolutely certainly welcome students who are interested in all of these very, very important areas.
Thank you. And I think that this is your journey. You have to find the program that is going to be best for you. And not all MD PhD programs are the same. And you have to find the program that is going to be the best fit for you. And part of that goes to knowing yourself in that personal statement that Dr. Swartz mentioned even earlier, as you're putting your personal statement together, to make sure that you know what your interests are in choosing the direction that you want to go. And it may be in justice and social sciences, or it may be in bench work or clinical work. But understanding yourself and where you would like to see yourself go is really important. And then things will happen and life will evolve, and you can figure out how your work can impact the health and well-being for all. So thank you for sharing that. Loren, I know this is a big question that we get from students all the time is, but what happens next? And, what happens after the MD PhD program? It's already that, 8-year span that students are going to be in training. How do the graduates of your program fare in regards to training after medical school? Do people go into residency? Do they do a postdoc? We had Dr. Ellis, who presented earlier, who went directly into work in industry. What are your thoughts on this, and where do people go after completing your program?
And I'm sure this answer is the same, for Dr. Swartz and Corvera. I would say the overwhelming majority go on to residency training. I think there are shifts, in how folks are thinking about this and in the, workforce in general, but I still think that it's fair to say that the students that pursue MD-PhD training are really wanting to do that blend that Dr. Corvera talked about at the very beginning. They want to marry what they see in the hospital with a motivation to make a difference by going back to the lab and addressing those challenges. So I think the overwhelming majority of graduates across the country are going into residency and fellowship training programs and seeing it all the way through. And that's certainly the case here. I would say, other tracks include students that decide that they want to pursue a research-focused career and they forgo residency training and they move on to a postdoctoral fellowship. And that does occur. I would say in our program, it occurs maybe once every 4 or 5 years. We have a student that does that. And there were certainly students, colleagues of mine, when I went through the MD-PhD training process that did the same, where they didn't pursue residency and they became, incredibly accomplished scientists. So I think that is definitely a path that is taken, but it's the minority that do that. And then I think what we're starting to see now, which you just mentioned, Alden, is something entirely new, which is not just something for MD PhDs and MDs, it's also especially happening for PhD students and postdocs, which is, the path to, fulfilling a physician scientist vision is to go and discover drugs and make a difference, right? You think about the Pfizer vaccine and the mRNA technology that went into that and what impact, right? What unbelievable impact. Now, in the old days, I think it's fair to say that if you went from an MD PhD training program or residency or fellowship and then right into a pharma company, you kind of be looked at, a little bit askance, and I think that has definitely changed because people appreciate that biotech has an enormous role in bringing unbelievably high impact innovations, not only to the country, but to the world. And the COVID situation is just a perfect example. So in our program, we are seeing students take time off, usually after the PhD for a year or two. If they have a successful PhD, they will try to start a company here in Cambridge, or they will work with their PI to do that, or they will do consulting for a startup just to see what it's like. And we have definitely had students that have elected to delay residency and maybe spend a year or 2 or 3, fashioning a new company and serving as a CEO or a CSO. And that is a very recent phenomenon, but it's happened this year for us with our graduating class this very year, where we had several students who started their own companies, raised funds, and are basically doing the clinical translation that has arisen directly from their PhD research studies. Obviously that's its own 45-minute discussion, but it's exciting, and I think we're going to see more of it.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. The possibilities are endless, whether it's a traditional route or an emerging opportunity for students to consider. As we get towards the end, Talia, are there any other major points that a student should consider when thinking about an MD PhD program that we haven't discussed over the past hour and a half?
Goodness, what a big question. I will try to cover anything that we may have missed, and I'm seeing a lot of important questions in the Q&A as well. I'm thinking of 3 major topics that are helpful to address in terms of applicants who are considering MD PhD, and these are common questions that we get. One of them is about taking gap years between undergrad and applying to MD PhD. And as the age to first independent NIH funding is later and later over the decades, we are aiming as a community to try to shorten this training because it is too long. And 44 years old is the average time for first R01 for an MD PhD grad is just too. It could be younger. It would be wonderful for us to not add more time to the training. And so what that means is that if you are as an undergraduate student, have done important research that has allowed you to test a hypothesis and think rigorously about the science, and you are thinking about taking a 1 to 2 years because you think it will boost your application, you should really get opinions about whether that is necessary. And it's because you don't specifically need publications to be a successful MD-PhD candidate, and you don't need years. It's not about the years, it's about the depth of the research that you've done. And I think that's really important because the number of applicants that feel the need to take gap years has been expanding over the years. And, you know, it is a question of whether you feel that that's necessary to prove to yourself that this is something that you want to do. That is a different question than whether you have to do it because it looks good on your application. And so if there are those of you who are thinking about the question of taking a gap year or years or not, you really want to think, do I really know that I want to do this? Have I done science enough to have experienced it at the depth where I can talk about it on a high level, understand the question, understand the premise, and understand sort of next steps, what I would do if I were running this project and some of the pitfalls? If you can have a conversation like that, you probably don't need to take additional years of training. And so there are multiple different ways that you may have gotten that. You may have done multiple summers that have been really enriched experiences. You may have done an undergraduate research project or a senior thesis, or you may not have had that and then feel like you need to take some post-bac training. And all of that is okay, but there shouldn't be the sentiment at the outset that you must do the post-bac. I think that's really important. The other thing is that people's careers take twists and turns. And as we heard from the panelists in the first time, you can't really plan out this whole training and know exactly what you want to do at the end of it. So if things happen in a way that wasn't exactly your plan, that is okay. There are so many different ways to be a physician scientist, and the physician scientist workforce nationally is 50% MDs and 50% MD PhDs. And so if it seems like you may want to pursue one route, but maybe, I don't know, life gave you different circumstances, there are many different ways to get to where you want to be. And the same is true for after graduating with the match. The beauty of the physician scientist training is that as a physician researcher, you can really focus your science in any direction you want it to. And so maybe you're interested in matching in a competitive specialty that you didn't match in, but then decide on doing something else. You can take your science in any direction you want. And so I'm an HIV researcher and I'm doing work on cardiovascular disease and substance abuse, and I don't have training in that, but my science has taken us in interesting ways that have allowed us to pivot. And so this career training is so deep and broad in that it allows you so many different options. And I think it's helpful in keeping an open mind. You can sort of think about ideas, but not be discouraged if your path sort of takes you in a different way, because if you have a destination at the end of it, or if you pivot, that will allow you interesting and new opportunities as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for wrapping it up. And I think that was a really good way to end the session. We are at 5:29, and I just want to say thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Walensky, Dr. Swartz, and Dr. Corvera. I think this was a wonderful discussion. Hopefully folks, as they're thinking about the application process to an MD PhD, it's less of a mystery and seems to be clearer. We have a very brief survey. If you can just click through that, we would appreciate it. We have some information about the Tour for Diversity, the Office for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Partnership at Harvard Medical School, and the Biomedical Sciences Career Program, where you can find more information. As I mentioned, the webinar will be recorded, is recorded, and will be posted on our website for you to go back and review. And we will do our best to maybe try and answer some of those questions that we didn't get to in another forum, either a frequently asked questions forum that we can attach with the posting of the website. Again, thank you to our panelists, both the first and second panelists. Thank you to Pinar and Jasmine for helping to pull this together. And we wish you all the best. Enjoy your afternoon. Have a good day.